Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. Now, a few years ago, Paul McCartney released today's record, which is Egypt Station. I heard a couple of the singles at the time from the record, Come On To Me and Fuh You, but only recently have I taken the opportunity to listen to the record in full as a piece of art. And that feels important because while doing research on it, I saw that McCartney went on Jimmy Fallon to promote it at the time. And Fallon suggested that this was really a concept album. And McCartney really liked that idea. He had the sense that these days people don't listen to album from beginning to end, which is funny because I take forever to listen to albums because I feel like I have to find a time where I'm sure I can listen to them from beginning to end. But Fallon notes that it's a concept album by saying, there are a couple mood-setting tracks. Track 1 and track 15 of the record are called Station 1 and Station 2, and they're pretty much just sound effects tracks that set the mood that in some abstract way, this album represents a train journey. McCartney seemed to agree with that notion. Now, I love the cover art for this record, and it turns out that was painted by McCartney himself. So I love that Paul McCartney continues to be ambitious. It's really exciting that he clearly put a lot into this album. It's rife with material. The cover art is great. But at the same time, I was a bit frustrated, a bit confused by the whole concept thing because I'm like, what really is the concept? It's certainly not literally about Egypt or trains. So what I ended up doing is I listened to this album several times. I tried looking up the individual songs on it. And the way I would put it is Egypt Station is a concept album, but you have to really want it to be to appreciate that way. So Paul McCartney is someone who's always been known for melody more than lyrics. He's not gonna, write a song that makes a very explicit point the way John Lennon sometimes would. And if that's your writing style, it's just a bit harder to put together a very coherent concept album. So early on, I had to come up with the hypothesis. What is the concept of Egypt Station? And the idea that came pretty quickly is that the different stations represent different stages in McCartney's life. But I had a problem with that theory. I've never read a full-fledged biography of Paul McCartney or anything. I've put different pieces of his life together over the years. But here's the thing, McCartney is a real person. And the little details a middling fan, let alone the casual listener, are going to put together, they're going to miss a lot of the key details. This man has been alive now 79 years, so all we know are, a few important snapshots, but so much of the life is missing. So one song where I really thought about this was a track called Confidante. And the first time I heard it, I thought, this has to be about John Lennon. He's singing a song about a friend close like no other who he fell out with. But then I looked a little closely and I started to doubt that this was another song about John Lennon because that's a topic Paul has absolutely written about before. So I noticed, for example, he wrote a song about dreams of a far off land. And I started to think maybe it's not about John, maybe it's about George, because so many of George's ideas came from India, the far off land. And then there's this other lyric where Paul says, I fell out of love with you and brought our romance to the end. So if this is a song about the Beatles, that would sound like Paul saying, I ended the Beatles, when his position is that if it was anyone who did it, it was John. It was John who had really had enough, and Paul wanted to keep the Beatles going. So those two lines made me doubt it was about John, and, I wasn't too confident in my theory that it was about George. But then it turns out that there's this wonderful website called the McCartney Project, which amongst other things compiles quotes that McCartney has given in, interviews with various sources about, I think, every single song that he's written. And thanks to that website, I was able to figure out the song is not about John, it's not about George, it's not even about a person. It's a song about Paul's first acoustic guitar, a guitar he fell out of love with when he became the bass player for the Beatles, when he had access to more guitars because he had money, and it's about falling back in love with the experience of playing that old acoustic guitar. Another song that could be misinterpreted if you're only thinking about Paul's life through the most famous snapshots is Happy With You. So this is a song about a singer leaving the party life behind and being very happy in a marriage. Now, Paul McCartney very famously had a long and happy marriage to Linda until she died prematurely of cancer. But, like with John, McCartney has written songs about Linda over the years, and it would be silly to assume that's the only love he can write about now that he's, been happily married to Nancy for a while. And with this song, I do think Linda is still a huge influence, but I found this one quotation McCartney gave where he said that another influence for him was not just him sort of getting into drugs, he was a big weed guy and calming down a little bit when he got married, because he also had friends who, weren't able to stop, whose drug problems got far more serious. Ringo Starr being one of them, for instance. So while he might be sort of singing autobiographically about how Linda saved him from his middle of the road relationship to party culture, he's also kind of singing about those people who more dramatically needed to be saved. At first, putting together this video, I was really confounded by those two songs. I was thinking, are these simple John and Linda songs, or there is more going on? But thankfully, that McCartney Project website really helped me see how many interesting little autobiographical nuances were in each song, and how each song in here can be justified because it is not just a sort of groovy little song of the moment, but it speaks to some more fundamental part of McCartney's personality that has followed him all over the years. So to take the most divergent example, there's a song called Caesar Rock. And if you listen to it, you don't really hear Caesar Rock, you hear She's a Rock. And apparently that name came up because when they were editing it and distorting McCartney's voice in the process, he thought it sort of came out not really sounding like She's a Rock, but Caesar Rock. And apparently there was a debate in the recording process. Is it right to auto-tune Paul McCartney's voice or distort it in any way? Because he's not some modern pop singer. He's one of the classics. He's up on a pedestal. He has to, uphold the decorum of music. But then Paul said, wait a minute. We were, one of the first ones to do all sorts of weird, surreal, non-human stuff. Like take the recordings we did on Revolver, take Tomorrow Never Knows. Modern, cutting edge, that's just as much part of the Beatle and the McCartney brand as being classic. So in that way, even, a silly little jam like Caesar Rock has autobiographical significance to McCartney. Another somewhat fringe example is the final medley of Hunt You Down, Naked, and Sea Link. So Paul McCartney cites Prince as a major influence on it, and he also describes the significance of the word naked to him, that he feels like in so much of life, so many people feel socially naked, like you don't feel like you belong, you feel out of place. And I believe it was in the Fallon interview, though maybe the Colbert, I confuse all my late night hosts, where he said this as well, that lots of the time he does not think of himself as a celebrity. Like obviously lots of the time he has to, but he says to this day, he is still amazed when he hears people talking about his songs like they're more important than anyone else's songs. Like lots of the time, he just feels like an ordinary guy who fanboys over other people's music. He fanboys over Prince. So again, this last track might be more of a jam, but part of what's in it is the sense that we, again, see this famous guy, McCartney, who is in this famous relationship with John Lennon, but to him, he's just a guy who likes music. And that's why it's kind of makes sense as a way of concluding this subtle yet epic autobiographical album. You have a song called Do It Now. This one turns out to be a catchphrase that Paul McCartney's dad used, so taking things way back. There's a track called Back in Brazil, which may seem a bit opaque to casual listeners, especially because there's this part where they chant the Japanese word Ichiban. And I believe when Paul McCartney was asked about that, he said, I'll get back to why I included that later. But one reason why someone like Paul McCartney might have a song called Back in Brazil on his record is, well, if you've been a world famous musician over so many years, you're not just going to have a relationship to your little town. You can write a really casual, eccentric song about, lots of major popular population centers where you might have performed a concert and spent some time. So he's just able to casually create this scene in Brazil, even though he is not Brazilian, because he has this sort of almost citizen of the world sense being a touring musician. The track Dominoes is about how little problems can feel overwhelming, as if they've knocked down a chain of dominoes. And this again gets at the fact that a lot of McCartney's life is about feeling ordinary and small and not about the celebrity. Hand in Hand, meanwhile, is a love song that is very specifically about McCartney's current wife, Nancy, where you wouldn't know that looking at the lyrics, but that's what he says. So the record speaks to a lot of different moments in McCartney's life. And it's interesting that it doesn't always do so in the most obvious ways. Part of the fun of listening to this record is reading all the little details, going, oh, and then listening to them again, and then liking the songs so much better because they aren't just jams. You hear the meaning, the inspiration, the significance of them. Now, part of the reason with this album, I did sort of scratch my head over, is it a concept album? What's the concept? I want to know these details. Is it's not just a straightforwardly joyful record to listen to. Like, it's not way out there, but there's certainly a lot of the songs have a kind of melancholy feel to them. And so there's a very raw opener called I Don't Know, which is very clearly a song about depression. And it just starts the album out in a very mellow place. And while none of the others are quite as mellow and depressing as I Don't Know, a lot of the other songs feel connected to that mood. Again, Dominoes being about how little problems in our life can come to overwhelm us. Now, my one real problem with the record is not the overtly depressing I Don't Know, because I think it's good to write an anthem about depression, but I also feel like there's just a slightly depressing tone to McCartney's voice these days, which means that the songs that are meant to be uplifting rockers, like Come On to Me and Who Cares, something about them doesn't feel that uplifting. And it's hard to put a finger on exactly what, other than that, there's a certain depressed quality to McCartney's voice. And look, it's been, roughly 50 years since he used an impressive vocal range to sing with the utter joy and Gotta Get You Into My Life and Maybe I'm Amazed. And, his voice is still very good for someone in the second half of his 70s, but the difference may explain why it's a bit harder for him to write happier songs than it used to be. Now, the most famous and controversial song from this record is Fuh You. So some hear it as McCartney, more so than on Caesar Rock, selling out to the pop stylings of his co-writer Ryan Tedder and, desperately trying to sway or trying to be a bad boy. I actually like it. It's an interesting mix of modern pop and classic Beatles. The string bridge in the song, sounds like something that George Martin would orchestrate on a Beatles song. And meanwhile, the sort of being a bad boy and swearing and being a bit crude, but only barely, it feels like it's within the realm of McCartney's spirit of writing silly love songs. And finally, because the lyrics are so ridiculously simple, they help his voice. They help, despite that little bit of a depressing quality, have a real oomph to it that doesn't come out in the slightly wordier rockers like Come On to Me. So I've talked about the autobiographical elements of this record. I've talked about the controversial song. I've talked about the little bit of downside. But finally, I want to talk about my favorite song of the record, and it's called People Want Peace. The story behind the song is that Paul was playing a show in Israel, but he felt a bit weird about that. And so he made a point of visiting and informally performing in Palestine. And then he met with some peace activists in Israel, and then he wrote the song as an anthem of hope that there could be harmony between the Palestinians and Israelis, that the current situation doesn't have to go on as it is forever. Now, if you just listen to the song without knowing the context, all you think is Paul was just doing a weird rehashing of John's Give Peace a Chance, especially because the end is this clapping choral singing bit going, people want peace. But when I re-listen to the song, firstly, it has a very energetic introduction that admits this has been done before, but it's also something different. There's almost, and what you hear is not a cheapness, but a power in the repetition. So look, John and Paul were different. John was explicit with his message and politics, sometimes at the expense of musical quality. Like if you listen to his and Yoko Ono song about Angela Davis, some of the lyrics are not particularly melodic or don't fit into the lines because they want to say exactly what they want to say about Angela Davis rather than just write a straightforwardly beautiful song. And, if John was alive today and continuing the trajectory he was on in the second half of his career, it's quite possible he'd be more hardline on the Israel-Palestine stuff than Paul is. He'd be out there with Roger Waters calling for boycott, divestment, sanction, and not doing shows in Israel at all. But just because Paul is less political than John, it doesn't mean they don't largely share a worldview. And I hear the subtle And that's why the subtle difference in People Want Peace from Give Peace a Chance really matters. So John had his initial song 50 years ago, and after years of it being perceived that there's this real enmity between John and Paul, it's kind of like John singing in the first half of a musical. He's the lonely hero. And then Paul in the third act comes boldly forward, says, "Oh no, love, you're not alone." Well, that's David Bowie, but he's saying, "John, I was always with you. And not only am I with you, the people are with you." Give Peace a Chance is that call to arms or call to non-arms, and People Want Peace is the people answering the call. Changing the world requires both radicals and ordinary people who take the message of the radicals. It takes John to make those bold calls, and Paul and all his fans and all their fans to say, "We're with you, John." So is Egypt Station my favorite record? No, because I want a little bit of joy in a record, and overall there's a bit too much of a melancholy quality to this one. But it's also one of the records I've listened to that's given me most reason to think, to react after it. And Fuh You is an obvious earworm. Confidant and Confidant and Happy With You have really stuck in my head. And of course, People Want Peace really struck a chord with me, and I'm going to keep singing that song in my head for a while. So look forward to more album reviews to come. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.